Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee workshop. Now, if you're like me, your collection of garden tools probably exceeds your ability to store them. You've got the lawnmower, the snow blower, the chainsaw, rakes, shovels, trimmers. Now, we're going to solve that problem for you today. Over the next 2 episodes, we're going to build a storage shed, and we're also going to give you a place to keep your trash. I'll show you that next, right here on the new Yankee workshop.
The new Yankee workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
Well, here's the site for our new storage shed with attached trash facility. If you'd like to build this structure, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. Now, the first thing I did to prepare the site was call in our landscaper, Roger Cook, and he took his bobcat and scraped away the topsoil so that I'm down to the subsoil. Then he brought in a load of what we call 3/4 inch crushed stone and just roughly spread it out in the area that I'm going to build over. The next thing was to get the lumber yard to drop off a load of material. Pressure treated for the floor frame, plywood, dimensional stock for the walls and roof, and even the roof shingles. Now, they also brought along some 6x6s. Pressure treated so that they can be in contact with the ground, and these will become the foundation for the shed. I've used this method of supporting decks many times in the past, and it works pretty well as long as you set it on the crushed stone. Now, the other thing is to make sure water doesn't gather, but because we're on a natural slope here, the water will just run through the stone and away, so the building won't be affected by frost. But one of the things I want to do is keep this structure low. So I'm going to use this 10-foot 6x6, which supports the back of the trash facility, as the gauge. I'm going to set it as close to grade as possible. Now, to loosen up this soil, I think the best tool will be my rototiller. But before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, with all the loose subsoil removed, I want to check the grade. The trash doors are going to open out, and I don't want them to hit the existing grade, so I want to check the depth of the trench. And I've got about 12 inches now, so I want to add about 6.5 inches of this crushed stone before I set the timber. Now I just grade the stone with my iron rake, and we'll compact it with a tamp. All right, with the beam cut to length, I can now set it in the trench and check it for level. Now, I may have to play with this for a while, but getting it perfectly level now will pay off in the end. All right, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, to anchor the sill, I'm going to use a piece of what's known as number 4 reinforcing bar that I picked up at our local masonry store. All right. Well, that took about 3 hours to get all these sills perfectly level and anchored, but that's going to make everything go a lot easier. For the last few minutes, I've been taking some 2x6s that are pressure-treated lumber and cutting them for the joist. I also took a 12-foot piece, which is the ribbon joist, and laid it out at 16 inches on center. Now, when I'm building a deck like this, I take a look at each joist and check it for a bow or a crown. I want any crown to face up. That way, when there's a load on the floor, it'll push it flat rather than sagging. Well, I've just snapped a chalk line a 1/2 inch in from the edge of my sill, and I'm going to pull the floor to it and tack it in place. That'll leave me a ledge to catch the trash bin floor. 173 1/8. I've checked my diagonals, so I know the floor frame is square. Now I can tack it to the sill on this side. Well, now I need to cut a series of blocks, so I'm using my sliding compound miter box with a built-in adjustable stop, which is great for making repetitive cuts. Now, these blocks that are right at the center of the floor do two things. They stiffen the floor, and they add support for the plywood joint. Well, now it's just a matter of nailing down some 3/4 inch plywood with 8B ring shank nails. Now, this assembly will be the trash bin floor. I'm using 2x4s because the loads will not be as great, but the techniques for assembling it are the same. With this as our platform, we can now begin to lay out the walls. Now, using the deck as a large sketch pad, I've laid out the gable ends. They will be on the short ends of the floor plane. I've laid it out full scale, and all the way down here at the bottom, I've set up a couple 2x4s, one for each gable end. That will be the sill plate. And I've laid out 2x4s, 16 inches on center for the studs. Now, here in the deck, I have some of the studs just loosely laid in place for the gable wall, and I've cut a pair of test rafters. They seem to fit pretty well. I want to show you how you calculate a rafter. You have to know a couple things. First, this angle, or the pitch of the roof. It's 45 degrees for this roof, and the pitch is a 12/12, which is 12 inches of run for every 12 inches of rise. The other thing I have to know is what the actual run is, and that's half the width of this building. It's 8 feet wide, so the run is 4 feet. Then, using a construction calculator, I can figure it out. First, I enter a decimal function and the angle, which is 45 degrees. I press tangent, and that comes out to be 1. I enter it into the calculator, go back to feet, inches, and 16ths, press 400, which is the run, enter that as the run, press the slope button, and there's the length of the rafter, 5 foot, 7 7/8. Now, the other way to figure it is to use a framing square or to simply take it off the plan. Now we'll just nail it together. Now, this is just a temporary block that represents the ridge pole. We'll pull it out just before we start to frame the roof. Now you can see why I notched only 1.5 inches out of the studs. It lets the studs stay flush with the rafter, and it gives me a place for nailing. All right, well, tomorrow's another day. Well, I got started this morning by building a header out of 2x6s and installing it in the gable, and that will help carry some of the roof load. Then I install these side pieces to frame in a small window opening, and below those pieces will be another 2x4, which is the sill for the window. All right, now we're ready to sheathe it with some 1/2 inch plywood. Now, perhaps you noticed that I've let the plywood hang below the sill plate by about 6 inches, and that's so I can attach it to the floor frame later. Now, to trim out the excess plywood at the window openings and even along the top edge of the roof, rather than use a circular saw, I find it easier to use a router with a 1/2 inch trimming bit. The ball bearing just rides up against the frame. Now, I finished making the second gable, which was identical to the first, And here I've assembled the back wall, the simplest of all, just studs 16 inches on center, no windows. And the last thing to do is to double up the top plate. Well, now I'm ready to erect the back wall. And this is the time that if you happen to have a neighbor or a friend who can give you a hand, you can use it. All right, Hugh, what do you think? You ready? Yeah. All right. Nice and easy. Okay, now you'll also notice that I've let the plywood overlap on this back wall for some nailing. Okay, right there. If you just steady it, I'm going to go on the outside. Okay, that looks good. Nice and easy. Now this framing is for one of the window units. Now of course, to make the thickness of the header match the width of my studs, I have to use a 1/2-inch plywood filler. And this is the header assembly for our double door. All right, Hugh, I can take it from here. Thanks for your help. Now with this 2x4 as a brace to hold the front wall plumb and square, I'm ready to sheath it. All right, well, that's all we're going to do today. It's starting to rain. I think we'll be able to finish that roof tomorrow. Well, good morning. We had a little bit of rain last night, but it's a beautiful day today. The first thing I did this morning was to set this brace to hold the front wall straight while I framed the roof. I also took some time to set up a proper scaffolding that goes all the way around the building. I'm going to need it to set the rafters, plywood the roof, and install the trim. Now I could do it from ladders, but it would take me twice as long. Now I've also laid out the ridge, and that's the next piece to set. Now the ridge pole is a piece of 2x10. And I've laid out the location of the rafters on the ridge pole and the corresponding location on the top of the wall plate. Now it's just a matter of setting the ridge in between the rafters we already set on the gables. Now here are all the 2x6 rafters to frame the roof, and they're cut to match the ones on the gable end. Now it wouldn't do to set all the rafters on one side because it might push the ridge over. So I'll set every other one, just toenailing them into the plate. Now the idea at the ridge is to have the tip of the rafter come even with the top corner. And this one's a little low, so we'll just pull it till it's even and nail it. And continue the same way down the rest of the ridge. Well, now it's just a matter of setting the corresponding rafters on the other side of the ridge. Now I'll just finish nailing them off up top. Now to sheathe this roof, I'm using 5/8-inch CDX plywood, which is plenty strong for this roof. Now take note that I've allowed the plywood sheathing of the roof to overhang the gable end by 3 inches. That's to account for a trim detail. Now this scrap piece of 2x6 that I've just ripped is for a block to make a return on the gable end. And notice that I've ripped it at quite a sharp angle, 45 degrees set on my circular saw. Now there's the block cut to length. And now I'll just clip off the corners. Now here's a piece of 2x8 that's been ripped at a 45-degree angle. I set the piece of 2x6 that I just made on top of it so the angles are flush, mark the corners, and clip those. And here's where they go, right on the corners of the gable end, set flush with the rafter tails. Now that's the second piece that I cut. Here's the first piece that I cut. Now this piece of 1x4 pine, which I like to buy pre-primed, will become the soffit. And it just gets nailed onto the bottom of the rafter tails. Now to attach the trim, I like to use 6-penny stainless steel ring shank nails. They cost a little bit more, but I know they're not going to rust. Next, I wrap a piece of pine underneath the blocks. Now this piece of 1x pine is known as the fascia board, and it's mitered on each end at a 45-degree angle. Now the piece of fascia that wraps the return is mitered on each end, and the top edge is beveled to match the bevel of the blocks. And there's a little block that goes right on the end to complete the fascia detail. Well, I got started this morning by milling some decorative trim strips that I'm going to apply over the fascia board. Now you can't go to the home center and buy stock like this, but if you can find the right router bit, you can mill up your own. This is known as an edge beating bit. They come in a variety of sizes. This one happens to be a 5/8 inch diameter. The one that's set up in the router table is a 1/2 inch diameter. Now the bit is made so that it removes just a little bit of material at the top of the bead, but it gives a nice rounded edge to the piece. Well, wait till you see what this looks like on our building. I've already wrapped the returns. Now I'm just putting the piece on the long fascia. You know, it's that shadow line that makes all the difference in the world. Now for a finishing touch on the return, I'm going to put this board on. It's actually a little roof for the return. I've made a slot in the main roof plywood so I can slide it into position. Okay, now I've put a bead of caulking at the joint of the hip, and here's the little return piece. Now the tricky part is making the cut along the hip, but not if you have a compound miter box. Now the best way to determine the angles for these pieces is to actually make a couple trial cuts before you cut your final stock. For the blocks that I have and the pitch of the roof that I'm working with, I had to swing the table to 35 degrees and tip the saw to 31.5 degrees. All right. Now for the rake boards. First, I have to build up some blocking under the overhang. Now here we have a 2x4, the entire length, and cut to fit. Now the next piece to apply is this piece of pine, which is called the plancha, and it goes underneath the 2x. The tricky part is making this notch right down here. I'll show you how I did that. First, I've turned the saw table to 45 degrees. Now I'm going to tip the saw 45 degrees. I want to make a cut right from this corner at a 45-degree angle until I meet the line on the back side. Now just swing the table back to 0, tip the saw to 0, and make a short, straight cut. We'll finish it off with a handsaw. This piece of 1x6 will become the rake boards. The lower end of each rake board has to be cut at a 45-degree angle and a 45-degree bevel. Now with the bottom cut made, I can tack it in place and mark the top. Now up here, it's just going to be a 45-degree miter, no bevel. Now after a couple trial fits, this seems to fit just fine. We can nail it all off. And finally, another piece of that beaded trim that we made in the shop to dress up the rake board. Now for our roof, I'm going to use red cedar wood shingles. And the first step is to put down a layer of 15-pound felt paper, sometimes called tar paper. The next step is to apply this nylon matrix. It's a mat that'll actually hold the shingles up from the surface a little bit, allowing air to come in from the bottom and the edges to ventilate the roof. This will dry out the underside of the shingles, preventing them from curling. Now there is some expense to adding this mat, but it'll make the roof last much longer. Now for the starter course of shingles, I've installed a string line from one end of the roof to the other, about an inch in front of the fascia board. I'll take each shingle and slide it down so it just comes to the line but doesn't push it away, and install it with a couple nails. Now I'm ready for the second course. Each shingle should overlap the joint by no less than an inch. I want to slide it down so that it's 1/8 of an inch below the starter course, and I want to leave about 1/8 of an inch gap for expansion and contraction. Well, we're making some good progress. Now you'll notice that I've attached a cleat to the roof. It's just a piece of pine that I've temporarily attached along the chalk line for each course, and I'll move it up with each successive course. It's very useful to support the shingles as I lay them out. Now the thing that I really have to keep in mind as I place each shingle is that I stagger the joints, and that the joints do not align within 3 courses. Now with the shingles run all the way up to the ridge, it's just a matter of trimming off the excess right along a line that I've snapped. Now with both sides of the roof shingled, it's time to deal with the ridge. To allow the air to come out from the matrix, we want to have a ridge vent, a capped ridge vent. So I'm going to use this material right here. It's a plastic material, looks a bit like corrugated cardboard. It allows the air to get out and it keeps the water from blowing in. We'll just nail that in place. Now the manufacturer of the vent strip supplies this end cap, and now all we want to do is cover the whole thing with a couple cedar boards. Now even though the roof pitch is framed at 45 degrees, the shingles are tapered so they flatten it out slightly. So I have to bevel the edges of the ridge boards about 5 degrees. Now this is hard enough to do here on the ground. It's murder to do if you're up on the roof. All right, that's going to look good. It just sticks over the cap a little bit, and I'll attach it with some screws. Well, this shed is going to be great. I'm going to have plenty of room for my rototiller and my snowblower, as well as my lawnmower and all the other hand gardening tools that I have. Of equal importance to this shed is our rubbish and recycling facility that's going right on the back here. Now I started this morning by building one of the gable walls, and I'm ready to build the second one. Well, let's put her in place and drive it home. Now this is a piece of 2x6 that I've beveled at the top at 30 degrees and notched at the bottom to fit over the end wall. And this will be the ledger against which I'll set the rafters. Now wherever I'm driving a nail, it's not going just into the plywood, it's hitting the stud on the other side. Now here's a stud and a jack that'll support a header across the front. I'll pin that to the floor and to the end wall. Now the header is made up of two 2x6s that have a piece of 1/2-inch plywood right in the middle and a 2x4 on top. Now there's a post right here in the middle, and that'll be to hinge the doors. Now this is not much of a roof span, so I can use 2x4s for the rafters. And I've cut them so that they overhang the header by 3/4 of an inch. Now I'm going to use this piece of 5/8-inch plywood for the roof. That should be plenty strong enough. Now I know the plywood is square, so I can use it as a lever to square up the frame, as long as I nail one end first. Now these blocks will be used to secure the vertical siding. Now the siding for the trash shelter is 1x6 Western red cedar, and it's tongue and groove. It has a rough side and a smooth side. We're going to put the smooth side out. For the piece that goes up against the shed area, I've ripped off the tongue. I'm going to attach the siding to the frame with 6-penny galvanized finish nails through the tongue so that they won't be seen later. Now it's just a matter of trimming off the excess with the circular saw and then doing the other end. Whenever I install unprimed trim at this time of the year, I like to put a coat of paint on it as soon as possible. You never know when it's going to rain or when it's going to be too cold. It's also a lot easier to do it now than to try to cut in around it later. Now I install a 1x6 rake board on each end, and you'll notice that I'm leaving it long. I'll trim it after I install the fascia. Now this is a plumb line, and this is the level line. And it's tar paper time again. And a little bit more of my nylon mat to keep the shingles dry. Well, now we'll shingle the roof, just like we did earlier on the main roof, being sure to stagger the joints and leave a space between the shingles. All right, that takes care of the wood shingling. Now I'm going to take a piece of lead and run it on the roof and up the wall to waterproof this joint. Now lead is very soft, and by using a 2x4 to distribute the blows of the hammer, I can easily form it into the corner. Well, now for some trim. The first piece of trim I want to install is known as a water table. Here I'm using a 1x6, and architecturally it really defines the bottom of the building. I first installed a piece of tar paper as a barrier, and now I'll just nail it in place. Feet long. Well, now for the last few minutes I've moved the operation over here to the workshop. And I'm starting to form a drip cap which will sit on top of that water table. I've taken some 2x4 cedar and ripped it into strips 1 5/8 wide. I've now tipped the saw blade to 10 degrees, and I'm going to run the top edge of the drip cap. Now with the blade still at 10 degrees, but a bit lower, and the fence moved away, I can make the second pass. Now the final pass is a little kerf cut, so that as the water rolls off the edge, it'll drop off instead of running on top of the water table board. Now this is another element of the trim called the corner boards. They're made up of 5/4 by 5 pre-primed pine, and you'll notice that I've beveled the bottom of each piece so that it'll meet the bevel of the drip cap. I'm going to nail them all together here in the shop and then bring them out to the shed. Now these pieces of 5/4 by 6 will become the freeze boards. They sit right up underneath the soffit. The clapboards will come up to meet them. That's why I'm making a rabbet in the back side so I can slip the clapboard underneath. Now I like to run a bead of caulking between the water table board and the drip cap. All right, let's see how this goes together. It's going to be good. Now in order to install the corner board, I have to chisel out a little bit of the drip cap so that it'll come down tight. Now before I set the corner board in place, I want to run a bead of caulking. Now I'm nailing off the corner board about every 16 inches, and I'm using a ring shank 8-penny stainless steel nail. All right, now for those freeze boards. Now the freeze board just fits tight up against the soffit. Now to dress up where the freeze board meets the soffit, I'm just going to install a 3/4 inch quarter round. Oh, good morning. I thought I'd get started today by working on the windows we're going to use for our shed. Now, I purchased some standard double-hung windows from my lumberyard. These are straight out of the factory. Now, when they arrived, they had this type of casing called a brick mold casing. And I don't really like this look. I want a more flush look. So I've removed the brick mold casings, and now I'm going to attach some strips of pine along the edge so that I can fasten the window in the opening. Then I'll cover the seam with a half-round piece of cedar. I'm just going to use biscuits and glue to hold these pieces on. All right, well, while that dries, let's make the molding. Now, to make the molding for the windows, I've ripped some pieces of cedar 1.25 inches square. I've set up a 1/2 inch radius roundover bit in my router shaper table, and I'm just going to ease 2 corners. The first cut I want to make is at 15 degrees. And that cut will match the slope of the window sill. With it set in position, I can now mark the length and miter the corner. Now a little bit of glue, and I'll just secure the pieces in place with some 6-penny finish nails. And the last step is to trim back the horns on the sill flush to the molding. Now here's one of the windows for the gable end. Now this is not a stock window unit. I bought the sash, but I made the frame. And here are the various parts. Here's the sash. I picked up a piece of standard windowsill from the lumberyard. And this is just 1 x stock. The first thing I want to do is cut the sill to size. Now with my stacked dado head cutter set up in the table saw, I can make dados in the side jamb, one for the top header piece and one for the sill. Now I'll just set the miter gauge 15 degrees off of 90 and plow out the dado for the sill. Now I'll just nail it together with 5-penny box nails. No glue is required. Now when I install the sill, I'm going to use a scrap as a spacer because I want to be able to slip the casing down later. Now these thin strips are stops against which the sash will rest. Now I've just nibbled away a notch in the casing, and that's so that it can fit over the sill. And now for the moldings. And now I can set the sash in place and a couple little stops to hold it. Now we can put the windows in and start the clapboarding. The first windows that I want to put in are the double hung windows on the front of the shed. And now you can see that the casing ends up flush with the plywood so that I can have the clapboards run right up to the molding. Now I want to raise the window up so I have a 4-inch space at the top and keep it centered. Okay, that's nice and plumb. I can nail it off. Well, now for the little windows that go in the gable end. I gave it a coat of paint because it's a lot easier to do it on the ground than it is up here. I'll just center it in the opening and nail it in place. Now the next thing that I like to do is put some paper before I side. I like to use this red rosin paper. It's inexpensive and it gives a little bit of a barrier between the siding and the sheathing. Now there are 2 more final pieces of trim to install. These 5/4 inch thick strips that fit tightly up against the overhang of the gable, and then I'll just fit the clapboards into that. There's one here and one down the other side. While I have the scaffolding here, I'm going to clapboard the gable end first. There's a lot of tricky cuts, and this is a nice, comfortable platform to work on. Now, for reference, I'm going to have a full course of clapboard coming all the way up to the bottom of this frieze board. So I've transferred that line around, and that becomes my starting point. The butt edge of the clapboard is the starting point. I've laid out 4-inch on center for the exposure all the way up to the peak, and I've put some caulking in the corner. Now when I nail this first one, I'm not going to nail it at the butt edge where I usually do. I'm going to nail it up here. That way I can slip the clapboard up from below when I finish this end. Now these pencil lines show the location of the studs so that I make sure that I'm nailing the clapboards right to the studs. Now I'm just going to take a scrap of clapboard and tack it in place. Now the clap acts as a guide for my handsaw. Now I can remove this little piece, and that means I don't have to notch around it with the clapboard. It's a lot easier. For the next clapboard, I tack it in place as close as I can to the return and at the correct height. Draw a line across, and then I can start the layout for this cut. I measure up from the line to the soffit. It's 1.25 inches. Transfer that to the clap. Now over here to the bottom of the molding, 2 9/16. Now up to the very peak of this roof here, the edge, 4 5/16. Now we'll just draw some horizontal lines. Now here I'm just using a pair of dividers to scribe the return. The distance that they're set to is the distance from the corner board to the end of the clapboard. Now we'll try to cut it out. Now we'll switch to a coping saw and finish it up. Okay, let's see how it fits. Not bad. Now I got to do the same thing to the other end. Now a little caulking before I slip it into place. I'm probably going to spend more time just fitting around these returns than the rest of the job put together. But that's where your eye's going to go when you look at the building, so it's got to be perfect. All right, that's good. Now, compared to these two, the rest are going to be easy. Now at the top of the window, so that the water doesn't run behind the molding, I'm going to take a piece of lead and form it in place. Next, the clapboard. Now with that set, I can roll the flashing over the edge. Well, we're really flying now. Well, we're losing light. I guess we'll finish this tomorrow. The entrance to the storage shed is about 4 feet wide, so I'm going to need 2 doors. Here's one of them. The frame is made up of 5/4 pine, and the panel is 1/2-inch tongue and groove paneling material. Now I need to make a groove in the stiles and the rails to receive the panel. To do that, I've set up my table saw with the stacked dado head cutter at a 1/2-inch width, and I've adjusted the fence so that the groove will be right in the center of the rails and stiles. Now the rails and stiles of the door are joined with mortise and tenon joinery, and I want to make the mortises in the stiles. So I'm using my dedicated mortising machine. That does a nice job, doesn't it? Now I'm ready to form the tenons on the rails, and the first thing that I have to do is make the shoulder cut. So I've set up a stop block which determines the length of the tenon, and I've adjusted the height of the saw to 5/16 of an inch. Well, now I turn to my tenoning jig, which is a device that allows me to safely hold the rails in a vertical position so that I can make the cheek cuts. Now with the stop block set up and my blade raised to 1 inch, I'm able to nibble away a portion of the tenon. This is called a haunch tenon. That little piece is the haunch. Now let me show you why I have to do that. When I ran the stiles, the groove for the panel goes all the way through. If I was to remove all of the tenon in that area, you'd see that groove. But by leaving a haunch, it fills it in. All right, now we're ready for a little bit of assembly. And I'm spreading glue in the mortises. On this particular type of glue, you only have to apply the glue to one surface. On the other surface, you just dampen it with water, believe it or not, because this is a moisture-cure glue. Now for the panels, I just slide in the pieces of tongue and groove board. And I don't put any glue in the grooves that are actually in the stiles and rails, but I will put a couple dabs in the groove of the panel to hold it together. Now I've got about 20 minutes of open time with this glue. Plenty of time to get everything aligned, and then I'll clamp it up and set it aside to dry. There's another type of door to build, and here's one set. These are the doors that close in the rubbish storage area. They're made out of the same 1x6 tongue and groove siding that I use to close in the rubbish area, and they're held together with these cleats, and this is known as a Z-brace door. They're really easy to make. Now here are the boards to make a door, cut to the correct length and the end pieces ripped to the correct width. Now what I want to do is clamp them together and make sure it's square. 49 7/8, that's good. No glue here, just some 1¼ inch galvanized screws. The diagonal part of the brace was cut at the miter box set at 40 degrees. Now once I finish this and give these doors a coat of paint, I'll be ready to install them. Well, it took a few hours to complete the clapboarding, and now I'm installing the Z-brace doors, which enclose the rubbish area. And they're held in place with some 4-inch T-hinges just applied to the surface. Okay, now to hold the doors closed, just a simple barrel bolt. That's all you need. Now over here on the other side of the shed, we have the doors to secure the tool area. Now the paint is actually still drying on these, but the doors are hung on 1½ pair of butt hinges. The left door is the fixed door, held in place with a couple barrel bolts, one at the bottom and one at the top hold the door closed. Now on the operating door, I've attached a strip of wood with glue and nails, and that overlaps the fixed door. Now all I have to do is figure out some kind of locking hardware, and I'll be ready to load in the garden tools. Finally a place to store the tools. Of course, now I got to figure out how I'm going to hang things on the walls, but at least everything's out of the weather. This was a good project.